The sixth day, Friday, June 2nd, 1944. Chapter 27. Paul and Flick were talking. They lay side by side on his bed. The lights were off, but the moon shone through the window. He was naked, as he had been when she entered the room. He always slept naked. He wore pajamas only to walk along the corridor to the bathroom. He had been asleep when she came in, but he had wakened fast and leaped out of bed, his unconscious mind assuming that a clandestine visit in the night must mean the Gestapo. He had had his hands around her throat before he realized who it was. He was astonished, thrilled, and grateful. He had closed the door, then kissed her, standing there for a long time. He was unprepared, and it felt like a dream. He was afraid he might wake up. She had caressed him, feeling his shoulders, and his back and his chest. Her hands were soft, but her touch was firm, exploring. "You have a lot of hair," she had whispered, "like an ape." "But not as handsome," she teased. He looked at her lips, delighting in the way they moved when she spoke, thinking that in a moment he would touch them with his own, and it would be lovely. He smiled. "Let's lie down." They lay on the bed, facing one another, but she did not take off any clothes, nor even her shoes. He found it strangely exciting to be naked with a woman who was fully dressed. He enjoyed it so much that he was in no hurry to move to the next base. He wanted this moment to last forever. "Tell me something," she said in a lazy, sensual voice. "What?" "Anything. I feel I don't know you." What was this? He had never had a girl behave like this. She came to his room in the night. She lay on his bed, but kept her clothes on. Then she questioned him. "Is that why you came?" he said lightly, washing her face. "To interrogate me?" She laughed softly. "Don't worry. I want to make love to you, but not in a hurry. Tell me about your first lover." He stroked her cheek with light fingertips, tracing the curve of her jaw. He did not know what she wanted, where she was going. She had thrown him off balance. "Can we touch while we talk?" "Yes." He kissed her lips. "And kiss too?" "Yes." "Then I think we should talk for just a little while, maybe a year or two." What was her name? Flick was not as confident as she pretended to be. He decided, in fact, she was nervous, and that was the reason for the questions. If it made her comfortable, he would answer. Her name was Linda. "We were terribly young. I'm embarrassed at how young we were. The first time I kissed her, she was 12, and I was 14. Can you imagine?" "Of course I can," she giggled, and for an instant she was a girl again. "I used to kiss boys when I was 12. We always had to pretend we were going out with a bunch of friends, and usually we started the evening that way. But pretty soon we would peel off from the crowd and go to a movie or something. We did that for a couple of years before we had real sex." "Where was this? In America?" "Paris. My father was military attaché at the embassy. Linda's parents owned a hotel that caters specially for American visitors. We used to run with a whole crowd of expatriated kids. We didn't make love. In the hotel, we had it easy. There were always empty rooms. What was it like the first time? Did you use any, precautions? She stole one of her father's rubbers. Flick's fingertips traced a course down his belly. He closed his eyes. She said, "Who put it on?" She did. It was very exciting. I nearly came right then. And if you're not careful... She moved her hand to his hip. "I'd like to have known you when you were 16. He opened his eyes. He no longer wanted to make this moment last forever. In fact, he found he was in a great hurry to move on. "Would you?" His mouth was dry, and he swallowed. "Would you like to take off some clothes?" "Yes, but speaking of precautions, in my billfold on the bedside table." "Good." She sat upright and unlaced her shoes, throwing them on the floor. She stood up and unbuttoned her blouse. She was tense. He could see, so he said, "Take your time. We have all night." It was a couple of years since Paul had watched a woman undress. He had been living on a diet of pin-ups, and they always wore elaborate confections of silk and lace, corsets and garter belts, and transparent negligees. Flick was wearing a loose cotton chemise, not a brassiere, and he guessed that the small, neat breasts he could see tantalizing outlined beneath it did not need support. She dropped her skirt. Her panties were plain, white cotton with frills around the legs. Her body was tiny but muscular. She looked like a schoolgirl getting changed for hockey practice, but he found that more exciting than a pin-up. She lay down again. "Is that better?" she said. He stroked her lip, feeling the warm skin, then the soft cotton, then the skin again. She was not yet ready. He could tell. He forced himself to be patient and let her set the pace. "You haven't told me about your first time," he said. To his surprise, she blushed. "It wasn't as nice as yours." "In what way?" "It was a horrible place, a dusty storeroom." He felt indignant. What kind of idiot could take a girl as special as Flick and submit her to a furtive quickie in a cupboard? "How old were you?" 22. He had expected her to say 17. Jeepers, at that age, you deserved a comfortable bed. That wasn't it, though. She was relaxing again. Paul could tell. He encouraged her to talk some more. "So what was wrong?" "Probably that I didn't really want to do it. I was talked into it." "Didn't you love the guy?" "Yes, I did, but I wasn't ready." "What was his name?" "I don't want to tell you." Paul guessed it was her husband, Michael, and decided not to question her any more. He kissed her and said, "May I touch your breasts?" "You can touch anything you like." No one had ever said that to him. He found her openness startling and exciting. He began to explore her body. In his experience, most women closed their eyes at this point, but she kept hers open, studying his face with a mixture of desire and curiosity that inflamed him more. It was as if by watching him, she was exploring him, instead of the other way around. His hands discovered the put shape of her breasts, and her fingertips got to know her shy nipples. Learning what they liked, he took off her panties. She had curly hair in the color of honey, lots of it, and under the hair, on the left side of a birthmark like a splash of tea. He bent his head and kissed her there, his lips feeling the crisp brush of her hair, his tongue tasting her moisture. He sensed her yielding to pleasure. Her nervousness vanished. Her arms and legs spread out in a star shape, slack, abandoned, but her hips strained toward him eagerly. He explored the folds of her sex with slow delight. Her movements became more urgent. She pushed his head away. Her face was flushed, and she was breathing hard. She reached across the bedside table, opened his billfold, and found the rubbers there, 3 of them in a small paper packet. She ripped the pack with fumbling fingers, took one out, and put it on him. Then she straddled him as he lay on his back. She bent to kiss him and said into his ear, "Oh boy, you feel so good inside me." Then she sat upright and began to move. "Take off your chemise," he said. She pulled it over her head. He watched her above him, her lovely face drawn into an expression of fierce concentration. Her pretty breasts moved delightfully. He felt like the luckiest man in the world. He wanted this to go on forever. No dawn, no tomorrow, no plane, no parachute, no war. In all of life, he thought there was nothing better than love. When it was over, Flick's first thought was, "What will I say to Mikhail?" She did not feel unhappy. She was full of love and desire for Paul. In a short time she had come to feel more intimate with him than she ever had with Mikhail. She wanted to make love to him every day for the rest of her life. That was the trouble. Her marriage was over, and she would have to tell Mikhail as soon as she saw him. She could not pretend even for a few minutes to feel the same about him. Mikhail was the only man she had been intimate with before Paul. She would have told Paul that, but she felt disloyal talking about Mikhail. It seemed more of a betrayal than simple adultery. One day she would tell Paul he was only her second lover, and she might say he was her best, but she would never talk to him about how sex was with Mikhail. However, it was not just sex that was difficult with Paul. It was herself. She had never asked Mikhail the way she had questioned Paul about her early sexual experiences. She had never said to him, "You can touch anything you like." She had never put a rub on him, or climbed on top of him to make love, or told him he felt good inside her. When she had lain down on the bed beside Paul, another personality had seemed to come out of her, just as a transformation had come over Mark when he walked into the Crisscross Club. She suddenly felt she could say anything she liked, do anything that took her fancy, be herself, without worrying what would be thought of her. It had never been like that with Mikhail. Beginning as a student, wanting to impress him, she had never really got on an even footing with him. She had continued to seek his approval, something he had never done with her. In bed she tried to please him, not herself. After a while, Paul said, "What are you thinking?" "About my marriage," she said. "What about it?" She wondered how much to confess. He had said earlier in the evening that he wanted to marry her, but that was before she came to his bedroom. Men never married girls who slept with them first. According to female folklore, it was not always true. Flick knew from her own experience with Mikhail, but all the same she decided to tell Paul half the truth, that it's over. A drastic decision. She raised herself on her elbow and looked at him. Does that bother you? On the contrary, I hope it means we might see each other again. Do you mean that? He put his arms around her. I'm scared to tell you, tell you how much I mean it. Scared of frightening you off. I said a foolish thing earlier about marrying me and having children. I meant it, but I said it in an arrogant way. That's okay, she said. When people are perfectly polite, it usually means they don't really care. A little awkwardness is more sincere. I guess you're right. I never thought of that. She stroked his face. She could see the bristles of his beard, and she realized the dawn light was strengthening. She forced herself not to look at her watch. She did not want to keep checking how much time they had left. She ran her hand over his face, mapping his features with her fingertips. The bushy eyebrows, the deep eye sockets, the big nose, the shut-off ear, the sensual lips, the lantern jaw. Do you have hot water? She said suddenly. Yes, it's a swanky room. There's a basin in the corner. She got up. He said, What are you doing? Stay there. She padded across the floor in her bare feet, feeling his eyes on her naked body, wishing she was not quite so broad across the hips. On a shelf over the sink was a mug containing toothpaste and a wooden toothbrush that she recognized as French. Next to the glass were a safety razor, a brush, and a bowl of shaving soap. She ran the hot tap, dipped the shaving brush in it, and worked up a lather in his soap bowl. Come on, he said. What is this? I'm going to shave you. Why? You'll see. She covered his face with lather, then got his safety razor and filled the tooth mug with hot water. She straddled him the way she had when they made love and shaved his face with careful, tender strokes. How did you learn to do this? He asked. Don't speak, she said. I watched my mother do it for my father. Many times. Dad was a drunk, and toward the end he couldn't hold the razor steady, so Ma had to shave him every day. Lift her chin. He did so obediently, and she shaved the sensitive skin of his throat. When she had finished, she soaked a flannel in hot water and wiped his face with it, then patted him dry with a clean towel. I should put on some face cream, but I bet you're too masculine to use it. It never occurred to me that I should. Never mind. What's next? Do you remember what you were doing to me just before I reached for your wallet? Yes. Did you wonder why I didn't let you go on longer? I thought you were impatient for intercourse. No, your bristles were scratching my thighs, right where the skin is most tender. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you can make it up to me. He frowned. How? She groaned with mock frustration. Come on, Einstein. Now that your bristles have gone. Oh, I see. Is that why you shaved me? Yes, of course it is. You want me to. She lay on her back, smiling, and parted her legs. Is this enough of a hint? He laughed. I guess it is, he said, and he bent over her. She closed her eyes. Chapter 28. The old ballroom was in the bombed restaurant of the Chateau of Sainte-Cécile. The room was only partly damaged. One end was a pile of debris, square stones and carved pediments, and chunks of painted wall in a dusty heap, but the other remained intact. The effect was picturesque. Deirdre thought with the morning sun shining through a great hole in the ceiling onto a row of broken pillars, like a Victorian painting of classical ruins. Deirdre had decided to hold his briefing in the ballroom. The alternative was to meet in Reva's office, and Deirdre did not want to give the men the impression that really was in charge. There was a small dais, presumably intended for the orchestra, on which he had placed a blackboard. The men had brought chairs from other parts of the building, and had placed them in front of the dais in 4 neat rows of 5, very German. Deirdre thought with a secret smile Frenchmen would have scattered the chairs any which way. Weber, who had assembled the team, sat on the dais facing the men, to emphasize that he was one of the commanders, not subordinates to Deirdre. The presence of 2 commanders, equal in rank and hostile to one another, was the greatest threat to the operation, Deirdre thought. On the blackboard he had chalked a neat map of the village of Châtel. It consisted of 3 large houses, presumably farms or wineries, plus 6 cottages and a bakery. The buildings were clustered around a crossroads, with vineyards to the north, west, and south, and to the east a large cow pasture, a kilometer long, bordered by a broad pond. Deirdre guessed that the field was used for grazing, because the ground was too wet for grapes. The parachutists will aim to land in the pasture, Deirdre said. It must be a regular landing and take-off field. It's level, plenty big, enough for Lysander, and long enough even for a Hudson. The pond next to it would be a useful landmark, visible from the air. There is a cowshed at the southern end of the field, where the reception committee probably takes shelter while they are waiting for the plane. He paused. The most important thing for everyone here to remember is that we want these parachutists to land. We must avoid any action that might betray our presence to the reception committee or the pilot. We have to be silent and invisible. If the plane turns around and returns home with the agents on board, we will have lost a golden opportunity. One of the parachutists is a woman who can give us information on most of the resistance circuits in northern France. If only we can get our hands on her. Weber spoke mainly to remind them that he was here. Allow me to underline what Major Franck has said. Take no risks. Do nothing ostentatious. Stick to the plan. Thank you, Major. Thank you, Major. Deirdre said. Lieutenant Hess has divided you into 2-man teams, designated A through L. Each building on the map is marked with a team letter. We will arrive at the village at 2000 hours. Very swiftly we will enter every building. All the residents will be brought to the largest of the 3 big houses, known as La Maison Grandine, and held there until it is all over. One of the men raised a hand. Weber barked, Shirla, you may speak. Sir, what if the resistance people call at a house? They will find it empty, and they may become suspicious. Deirdre nodded. Good question, but I don't think they will. My guess is that the reception committee are strangers here. They don't usually have agents parachute in near where sympathizers lives. It's an unnecessary security risk. I'm betting they arrive after dark, and go straight to the cowshed without bothering the villagers. Weber spoke again. This would be normal resistance procedure, he said, with the air of doctor giving a diagnosis. An amazing Grandin will be our headquarters, Theodore continued. Major Reba will be at command there. This was his scheme for keeping Reba away from the real action. The prisoners will be locked away in some convenient place, ideally a cellar. They must be kept quiet, so that we can hear the vehicle in which the reception committee arrive, and later the plane. Weber said, any prisoner who persistently makes noise may be shot. Deer continued, as soon as the villagers have been incarcerated, teams A, B, C, and D will take up concealed positions on the roads leading into the village. If any vehicles or personnel enter the village, you will report by shortwave radio, but you will do nothing more. At this point, you will not prevent people entering the village, and you will not do anything that might betray your presence. Looking around the room, Dieter wondered pessimistically whether the Gestapo men had brains enough to follow these orders. The enemy needs transport for 6 parachutists, plus the reception committee, so they will arrive in a truck or bus, or possibly several cars. I believe they will enter the pasture by this gate. The ground is quite dry at this time of year, so there is no danger of cars becoming bogged down and parked between the gate and the cowshed. Just here. He pointed to a spot on the map. Teams E, F, G, and H will be in the cluster of trees beside the pond, each equipped with a large battery searchlight. Teams I and J will remain at La Maison Grandin to guard the prisoners and maintain the command post with Major Reba. Dieter did not want Reba at the scene of the arrest. Teams K and L will be with me, behind this hedge near the cowshed. Hans had found out which of the men were the best shots and assigned them to work with Dieter. I will be in radio contact with all teams, and will be in command in the pasture. When we hear the plane, we do nothing. When we see the parachutists, we do nothing. We will watch the parachutists land and wait for the reception committee to round them up and assemble them near where the vehicles are parked. Dieter raised his voice. Mainly for the benefit of Reba. Not until this process has been completed will we arrest anyone. The men will not jump the gun unless a skittish officer told them to. When we are ready, I will give the signal. From this moment on, until the order to stand down is given, teams A, B, C, and D will arrest anyone attempting to enter or leave the village. Teams E, F, G, and H will switch on their searchlights and turn them on the enemy. Teams K and L will approach them with me and arrest them. No one is to fire on the enemy. Is that clear? Scholar, obviously the thinker among the group, raised his hand. Again, what if they fire on us? Do not return their fire. These people are useless to us dead. Lie flat and keep the lights trained on them. Only teams E and F are permitted to use their weapons, and they have orders to shoot to wound. We want to interrogate these parachutists, not kill them. The phone in the room rang, and Hans Hess picked it up. It's for you, he said to Dieter. We're Mills headquarters. The timing was lucky. Dira thought as he took the phone. He had called Walter Godel at La Roche-Guyon earlier, and had left a message asking Godel to call back. Now he said, "Walter, my friend, how is the field marshal?" "Fine. What do you want?" said Godel, abrupt as ever. "I thought the field marshal might like to know that we expect to carry off a small coup tonight. The rest of a group of saboteurs as they arrive." Dira hesitated to give details over the phone. But this was a German military line, and the risk that the resistance might be listening was very small. And it was crucial to get Godel's support for the operation. "My information is that one of them could tell us a great deal about several resistance circuits." "Excellent," said Godel. "As it happens, I am calling you from Paris. How long would it take me to drive to Reims? 2 hours? 3. Then I will join you on the raid." Dieter was delighted. "By all means," he said. "If that is what the field marshal would like, meet us at the chateau of Sainte-Cécile not later than 1900. He looked at Reba, who had gone slightly pale. "Very good," Godel hung up. Dieter handed the phone back to Hess. "Field Marshal Rommel's personal aide, Major Godel, will be joining us tonight," he said triumphantly. "Yet another reason for us to make sure that everything is done with impeccable efficiency." He smiled around the room, bringing his gaze to rest finally on Reba. "Entree fortunate." Chapter 29. All morning the Jackdaws drove north in a small bus. It was a slow journey through leafy woods and fields of green wheat, zigzagging from one sleepy market town to the next, circling London to the rest. The countryside seemed oblivious of the war or indeed of the 20th century, and Flick hoped it would long remain so. As they wound their way through medieval Winchester, she thought of Reims, another cathedral city, with uniformed Nazis strutting on the streets, and a Gestapo everywhere in their black cars, and she gave a short prayer of thanks that they had stopped at the English Channel. She sat next to Paul and watched the countryside for a while. Then, having been awake all night making love, she fell into a blissful sleep, with her head on his shoulder. At 2 in the afternoon they reached the village of Sandy in Bedfordshire. The bus went down a winding country road, turned onto an unpaved lane through a wood, and arrived at a large mansion called Tempsford House. Flick had been here before. It was the assembly point for the nearby Tempsford airfield. The mood of tranquility left her. Despite the 18th century elegance of the place, to her it symbolized the unbearable tension of the hours immediately before a flight into enemy territory. They were too late for lunch, but they got tea and sandwiches in the dining room. Flick drank her tea, but felt too anxious to eat. However, the others tucked in heartily. Afterwards, they were shown to their rooms. A little later, the woman met in the library. The room looked more like the wardrobe of a film studio. There were racks of coats and dresses, boxes of hats and shoes, cardboard cartons and labeled culottes, chaussettes, and mouchoirs, and a trestle table in the middle of the room, with several sewing machines. In charge of the operation was Madame Gilman, a slim woman of about 50 in a shirt-waist dress with a chic little matching jacket. She had spectacles on the end of her nose and a measuring tape around her neck, and she spoke to them in perfect French, with a Parisian accent. As you know, French clothes are distinctively different from British clothes. I won't say they are more stylish, but you know they are more stylish. She gave a French shrug, and the girls laughed. It was not just a question of style, Flick thought somberly. French jackets were normally about 10 inches longer than British, and there were numerous differences of detail, any of which could be the fatal clue that betrayed an agent. So all the clothes here had been bought in France, exchanged with refugees for new British clothes, or faithfully copied from French originals, then worn for a while so that they would not look new. Now it is summer, so we have cotton dresses, light wool suits, and shower-proof coats. She waved her hand at two young women sitting at sewing machines. My assistants will make alterations if the clothes don't fit quite perfectly. Flick said, we need clothes that are fairly expensive, but well worn. I want us to look like respectable women in case we are questioned by the Gestapo. When they needed to pose as cleaners, they could quickly downgrade their appearances by taking off their hats, gloves, and belts. Madame Gilman began with Ruby. She looked hard at her for a minute, then picked from the rack a navy dress and a tan raincoat. Try those. It's a man's coat. But in France today, no one can afford to be particular. She pointed across the room. You can change behind that screen if you wish. And for the very shy there is a little ante-room behind the desk. We think the owner of the house would used to lock himself in there to read dirty books. They laughed again, all but Flick, who had heard Madame Gilman's jokes before. The seamstress looked hard at Greta, then moved on, saying, I'll come back to you. She picked outfits for Jelly, Diana, and Maud, and they all went behind the screen. Then she turned to Flick and said in a low voice, Is this a joke? Why do you say that? She turned to Greta. You're a man. Flick gave a grunt of frustration and turned away. The seamstress had seen through Greta's disguise in seconds. It was a bad omen. Madame added, You might fool a lot of people, but not me. I can tell. Greta said, How? Madame Gilman shrugged. The proportions are all wrong. Your shoulders are too broad, your hips too narrow, your legs too muscular, your hands too big. It's obvious to an expert. Flick said irritably. She has to be a woman for this mission, so please dress her as best you can. Of course, but for God's sake, try not to let her be seen by a dressmaker. No problem. The Gestapo don't employ many of those. Flick's confidence was fake. She did not want Madame Gilman to know how worried she was. The seamstress looked again at Greta. I'll give you a contrasting skirt and blouse to reduce your height in a 3/4 length coat. She selected the clothes and handed them to Greta. Greta looked at them with disapproval. Her taste ran to more glamorous outfits. However, she did not complain. "I'm going to be shy and lock myself in the anteroom," she said. Finally, Madame gave Flick an apple green dress with a matching coat. "The color shows off your eyes," she said. "As long as you're not ostentatious, why shouldn't you look pretty? It may help you charm your way out of trouble." The dress was loose and looked like a tent on Flick, but she put on a leather belt to give it a waist. "You are so chic, just like a French girl," said Madame Gilman. Flick did not tell her that the main purpose of the belt was to hold a gun. They all put on their new clothes and paraded around the room. Preening and giggling, Madame Gilman had chosen well, and they liked what they had been given. But some of the garments needed adjusting. "While we are making alterations, you can choose some accessories," Madame said. They rapidly lost their inhibitions and clowned around in their underwear, throwing on hats and shoes, scarves and bags. They had momentarily forgotten the dangers ahead, Flick thought, and were taking simple pleasures in their new outfits. Greta came out of the anteroom, looking surprisingly glamorous. Flick studied her with interest. She had turned up the collar of the plain white blouse so that it looked stylish, and wore the shapeless coat draped over her shoulders, cloak style. Madame Gilman raised an eyebrow, but made no comment. Flick's dress had to be shortened. While that was being done, she studied the coat. Working undercover had given her a sharp eye for detail, and she anxiously checked the stitching, the lining, the buttons, and the pockets to make sure they were in the normal French style. She found no fault. The label in the collar said Galeries Lafayette. Flick showed Madame Gilman her lapel knife. It was only 3 inches long with a thin blade, but it was wickedly sharp. It had a small handle and no hilt. It came in a slim leather sheath, pierced with holes for a thread. "I want you to sew this to the coat under the lapel," Flick said. Madame Gilman nodded. "I can do this." She gave them each a little pile of underwear, 2 of everything, all with labels of French shops. With unerring accuracy, she had picked not just the right size, but the preferred style of each woman. Corsets for Jelly, pretty lacy slips for Maud, navy knickers and boned brassieres for Diana, simple chemises and panties for Ruby, and Flick. The handkerchief bear the laundry marks of different blemishes and reims, said Madame Gilman, with a touch of pride. Finally, she produced an assortment of bags: a canvas duffel, a Gladstone bag, a rucksack, and a selection of cheap fiber suitcases in different colors and sizes. Each woman got one. Inside she found a toothbrush, toothpaste, face powder, shoe polish, cigarettes, and matches, all French brands, even though they were going in only for a short time. Flick had insisted on the full kit for each of them. "Remember," Flick said, "you may not take with you anything that you have not been given this afternoon. Your life depends on that." The giggling stopped as they remembered the danger they would face in a few hours. Flick said, "All right, everybody, please go back to your rooms and change into your French outfits, including underwear." Then we'll meet downstairs for dinner. In the main drawing room of the house, a bar had been set up. When Flick walked in, it was occupied by a dozen or so men, some in RAF uniform, all of them Flick knew from previous visits, destined to make clandestine flights over France. A blackboard bore the names or code names of those who would leave tonight, together with the times they needed to depart from the house. Flick read Aristotle, 1950. Captain Jenkins and Lieutenant Ramsey, 2005. All Jackdaws, 2030. Colgate and Bunter, 2100. Mr. Blister, Paradox, Saxophone, 2205. She looked at her watch. It was 6:30. 2 hours to go. She sat at the bar and looked around, wondering which of them would come back and which would die in the field. Some were terribly young, smoking and telling jokes, looking as if they had no cares. The older ones looked hardened and savored their whiskey and gin in the grim knowledge that it might be their last. She thought about their parents, their wives or girlfriends, their babies and children. Tonight's work would leave some of them with a grief that would never entirely go away. Her somber reflections were interrupted by a sight that astonished her. Simon Fortescue, the slippery bureaucrat from MI6, walked into the bar in a pinstripe suit, accompanied by Dennis Boyer. Flick's jaw dropped. "Felicity, I'm so glad I caught you," said Simon. Without waiting for an invitation, he pulled up a stool for Denise. "Gin and tonic, please, barman. What would you like, Lady Denise?" "A martini, very dry." "And for you, Felicity?" Flick did not answer the question. "She's supposed to be in Scotland," she said. "Look, there seems to have been some misunderstanding. Denise has told me all about this policeman fellow." "No misunderstanding," Flick said abruptly. "Denise failed the course. That's all there is to it." Denise made a disgusted sound. Fortescue said, "I really don't see how a perfectly intelligent girl from a good family could fail. She's a blabbermouth." "What?" "She can't keep her damn mouth shut. She's not trustworthy. She shouldn't be walking around free." Denise said, "You insolent cat." Fortescue controlled his temper with an effort and lowered his voice. "Look, her brother is the Marquis of Inverloch, who's very close to the Prime Minister. Inverloch himself asked me to make sure Denise got a chance to do her bit. So you see, it would be dreadfully tactless to turn her down." Flick raised her voice. "Let me get this straight." One or two of the men nearby looked up. "As a favor to your upper-class friend, you're asking me to take someone untrustworthy on a dangerous mission behind enemy lines, is that it?" As she was speaking, Percy and Paul walked in. Percy glared at Fortescue with undisguised malevolence. Paul said, "Did I hear right?" Fortescue said, "I've brought Denise with me because it would be, frankly, an embarrassment to the government if she were left behind, and a danger to me if she were to come," Flick interrupted. "You're racing your breath. She's off the team." "Look, I don't want to have to pull rank." "What rank?" said Flick. I resigned from the Guards as a colonel, retired. And I'm in the civil service equivalent of the brigadier. Don't be ridiculous, Flick said. You're not even in the army. I'm ordering you to take Denise with you. Then I'll have to consider my response, said Flick. That's better. I'm sure you won't regret it. All right, here is my response. Fuck off. Fortescue went red. He had probably never been told to fuck off by a girl. He was uncharacteristically speechless. Well, said Denise, we certainly found out what type of person we're dealing with. Paul said, You're dealing with me. He turned to Fortescue. I'm in command of this operation, and I won't have Denise on the team. At any price. If you want to argue, call Monty. Well said, my boy, Percy added. Fortescue found his voice at last. He wagged a finger at Flick. The time will come, Mrs. Clariette, when you will regret saying that to me. He got off his stool. I'm sorry about this, Lady Denise, but I think we've done all we can here. They left. Stupid prat, Percy muttered. Let's have dinner, said Flick. The others were already in the dining room, waiting. As the Jackdaws began their last meal in England, Percy gave each of them an expensive gift. Silver cigarette cases for the smokers, gold powder compacts for the others. They have French here hallmarks, so you can take them with you, he said. The women were pleased, but he brought their mood back down with the next remark. They have a purpose, too. They are items that can easily be pawned for emergency funds if you get into real trouble. The food was plentiful, a banquet by wartime standards, and the Jackdaws tucked in with relish. Flick did not feel very hungry, but she forced herself to eat a big steak, knowing it was more meat than she would get in a week in France. When they finished supper, it was time to go to the airfield. They returned to the rooms to pick up their French bags, then boarded the bus. It took them along another country lane and across the railway line, then approached what looked like a cluster of farm buildings at the edge of a large flat field. A sign said Gibraltar from, but Flick knew that this was the RAF Tempsford, and the barns were heavily disguised Nissen huts. They went into what looked like a cowshed and found a uniformed RAF officer standing guard over steel racks of equipment. Before they were given their gear, each of them was searched. A box of British matches was found in Maud's suitcase. Diana had in her pocket a half-completed crossword torn from the Daily Mirror, which she swore she had intended to leave on the plane. And Jelly, the inveterate gambler, had a pack of playing cards with "Made in Birmingham" printed on every one. Paul distributed their identity cards, ration cards, and clothing coupons. Each woman was given 100,000 French francs, mostly in grubby thousand-franc notes. It was the equivalent of £500, enough to buy 2 Ford cars. They also got weapons, .45 caliber, Colt automatic pistols, and sharp double-bladed commando knives. Flick declined both. She took her personal gun, a Browning 9mm automatic. Around her waist she wore the leather belt into which she could push the pistol, or, at a pinch, the submachine gun. She also took her lapel knife instead of the commando knife. The commando knife was longer and deadlier, but more cumbersome. The great advantage of the lapel knife was that when the agent was asking to produce papers, she could instantly reach toward an inside pocket, then at the last moment pull the knife. In addition, there was a Lee Enfield rifle for Diana, and a Sten Mark II submachine gun with silencer for Flick. The plastic explosive Jelly would need was distributed evenly among the 6 women, so that even if 1 or 2 bags were lost, there would still be enough to do the job. Maud said, "It may blow me up." Jill explained that it was extraordinarily safe. "I knew a bloke who thought it was chocolate and ate some," she said. "Mind you," she added, "it didn't half give him the runs." They were offered the usual round, Mills grenades, with a conventional turtle shell finish, but Flick insisted on general purposes grenades in square cans, because they could also be used as explosive charges. Each woman got a fountain pen with a hollow cap containing a suicide pill. There was a compulsory visit to the bathroom before putting on the flying suit. It had a pistol pocket so that the agent could defend herself immediately on landing, if necessary. With the suit they donned helmet and goggles, and finally shrugged into the parachute harness. Paul asked Flick to step aside for a moment. He had held back the all-important special passes that would enable the woman to enter the chateau as cleaners. If a Jackdaw were to be captured by the Gestapo, this pass would betray the true purpose of the mission. For safety, he gave all the passes to Flick to be distributed at the last minute. Then he kissed her. She kissed him back with desperate passion, clutching his body to hers, shamelessly thrusting her tongue into his mouth, until she had to gasp for breath. "Don't get killed," he said into her ear. They were interrupted by a discreet cough. Flick smelled Percy's pipe. She broke the clinch. Percy said to Paul, "The pilot is waiting for word with you." Paul nodded and moved away. "Make sure he understands that Flick is the officer in command," Percy called after him. "Sure," Paul replied. Percy looked grim, and Flick had a bad feeling. "What's wrong?" she said. He took a sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "A motorcycle carrier from London. Bought this from SOE headquarters just before we left the house. It came in from Brian Standish last night." He sucked anxiously on his pipe and blew out clouds of smoke. Flick looked at the sheet of paper in the evening sunlight. It was a decrypt. Its contents hit her like a punch in the stomach. She looked up dismayed. Brian had been in the hands of the Gestapo only for a few seconds. So this claims. "Any reason to think otherwise?" "Ah, fuck it," she said loudly. A passing airman looked up sharply, surprised to hear a woman's voice utter such words. Flick crumpled the paper and threw it on the ground. Percy bent down, picked it up, and smothered out the creases. Let's try to stay calm and think clearly. Flick took a deep breath. We have a rule, she said insistently. Any agent who is captured by the enemy, whatever the circumstances, must immediately be returned to London for debriefing. Then you will have no wireless operators. I can manage without one. And what about the Charenton? I suppose it's natural that Mademoiselle Lemus might have recruited someone to help her. All recruits are supposed to be vetted by London. You know that rule has never been followed. At a minimum, they should be approved by the local commander. Well, he has been now. Michael is satisfied that Charenton is trustworthy, and Charenton saved Brian from the Gestapo. That whole scene in the cathedral can't have been deliberately staged, can it? Perhaps it never took place at all. And this message comes straight from Gestapo headquarters. But it has all the right security codes. Anyway, they wouldn't invent a story about his being captured and then released. They'd know that would arouse our suspicions. They would just say he had arrived safely. You're right, but still, I don't like it. No, nor do I, he said, surprising her. But I don't know what to do. She sighed. We have to take the risk. There's no time for precautions. If we don't disable the telephone exchange in the next 3 days, it will be too late. We have to go anyway. Pussy nodded. Flick saw that there were tears in his eyes. He put his pipe in his mouth and took it out again. Good girl, he said. His voice reduced to a whisper. Good girl.